Good evening, I'm Karen Fisher. On behalf of Nick Keehus Productions, attorney Edward Tabash, and Calvary Chapel, Anaheim, I welcome you to the Theism-Atheism debate. Tonight's topic is, does God exist? Which way does the evidence point? Our first speaker is Nick Keehus. Nick is a writer and professor of New Testament studies, theology, and apologetics, which have been his passion for the last 25 years. He has an MA in Theological Studies from Veritas Evangelical Seminary and is presently working on a PhD in Theological Studies from Asia Graduate School of Theology, a doctorate in Biblical and Theological Engagement from Bethel, and a PhD in Biblical History and Archaeology from Veritas Seminary. A native of Sweden, Nick moved to the U.S. in 1987. He's married to Stacy and they have 5 children. Nick and his family reside in Southern California. Our second speaker tonight is Eddie Tabash. Edward Tabash is a constitutional lawyer in the Los Angeles area. He graduated from UCLA in 1973, magna cum laude, with a bachelor's degree in political science. He graduated from Loyola Law School of Los Angeles in 1976. He is the son of an Orthodox rabbi from Lithuania and an Auschwitz surviving mother from Hungary. After decades of spiritual reflection and seeking, he has determined that the universe is natural, with no supernatural being or beings, no God or gods involved in the creation or perpetuation of our existence. He chairs the board of directors of the Center for Inquiry Transnational, a worldwide organization of secular humanists and scientific skeptics. The format for tonight will be as follows. Nick Keehus will speak first with a 30-minute opening statement. Eddie Tabash will speak second with a 30-minute opening statement. Nick Keehus will have a 15-minute time of rebuttal, followed by Edward Tabash with a 15-minute time of rebuttal. Following this, there will be a 30-minute question and answer period. Please write your questions on the cards provided on the pews and pass them to the center aisle. They'll be collected. The questions will be read aloud, and each opponent will have 2 minutes to give an answer to each question. Please indicate on the cards who the question is directed to. After the question and answer period, each debater will have 15 minutes to give a closing statement, and I ask that you would listen attentively to each speaker, whether or not you agree with what is being said. Thank you, and let's begin. Nick Keehus, will you please come to the podium, and I will start the timer when you are ready to begin. You will have 30 minutes.
Good evening. It's a privilege to be here tonight. And some 20 years ago, Mr. Tabash and I debated the topic of abortion in Orange County. So in a sense, this is our anniversary debate. I'm glad you're here, Eddie. It's always a privilege to debate you. To debate the question whether God exists is one of the greatest questions of humanity. Philosophers and theologians have debated this topic for hundreds and hundreds of years. Tonight, I will defend the position that God exists. By theism, I mean the theistic God that I'm defending tonight. He's self-existent, he's eternal, he possesses attributes like divine omniscience, omnipresence, and so forth. So it's not the God of deism, some remote divine landlord that created the cosmos and went on a long vacation. My 2 main contentions tonight are, number 1, there are good reasons to believe that theism is true. 2, there is no reason to believe that atheism is true. I will defend the first contention using 4 main strategies. The first one is theism can better account for and explain the meaning of life. 2, theism makes more sense than atheism in justifying an objective morality as opposed to moral relativism, which follows from the atheistic worldview. Number 3, recent discoveries in astrophysics, cosmology, and biology make it more plausible, seemingly true, to believe that there's a mind behind the universe and its origin. And finally, the laws of logic and mathematics are more compatible given the theistic framework than atheism. Having said that, we're not here to debate the resurrection of Christ, biblical inerrancy, or higher forms of criticism. These are points of doctrine that theologians and philosophers themselves differ on. We're here to simply debate the existence of God. Now, concerning the debate and discussions, whether God exists, Oxford atheist, J.L. Mackie, one of my favorite atheists, second to Tabash, he writes, "It is my view that the question whether there is or is not a God can and should be discussed rationally and reasonably, and that such discussion can be rewarding in that it can yield definite results. This is a genuine, meaningful question and an important one. In fact, too important for us to take sides about it arbitrarily. The issue is not so obscure or hidden, if you will, that relevant considerations of argument cannot be brought to bear upon it." Unquote. I think Mackie is correct here. In fact, the former atheist British philosopher Anthony Flew finally agreed that some form of theism, in his case deism, made more sense and can better account for some of these things. Anthony Flew, as some of you know, have been referred to as the world's most influential philosophical atheist. He gave it up, and in his book, There Is No God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind, Anthony Flew published some of these things that led to that change. After a lifetime of study, he finally abandoned atheism. So, while hearing the arguments from each side tonight, I would encourage you all to pay close attention to whether what is claimed has the ring of truth to it, if it just makes logical sense, or if we're stretching, what's more plausible, X, Y, or Z, and so forth. So, as I present my arguments this evening, I will touch on certain atheistic responses that I think would be, of course, contrary to what I say. But I don't know what Eddie is going to argue yet. So I don't want to set up any ad hominem attacks or straw men of the sort. We're just going to have to wait and see what Eddie has to share tonight. Now, to the arguments. Theism can better account for and explain the meaning of life. If God exists, then we can rest assured that there is real meaning to life. At least some meaning. Concerning your existence. Why are we here? Where are we going? Is there a destiny? Origin, meaning, morality, and so forth. The two great questions are, what is the source of the cosmos? And what is the purpose of being in the cosmos? If God exists, there must be a purpose to our existence. If God exists and created the universe, we can bet on the fact that you have purpose, and so do I, as does my opponent. But if atheism is true, we're no more than a cluster of glorified bacteria or freaks of nature. If all is matter, then all we are is matter in motion. Lawrence Krauss, one of the top atheists of our time, he writes, quote, "Every atom in your body came from a star that exploded, and the atoms in your left hand probably came from a different star than your right hand. It is really the most poetic thing I know about physics. You are all stardust." He further writes, "A universe without purpose should neither depress us nor suggest that our lives are purposeless. Through an awe-inspiring cosmic history, we find ourselves on this remote planet in a remote corner of the universe, endowed with intelligence and self-awareness. We should not despair, but should humbly rejoice in making the most of these gifts and celebrate our brief moment in the sun." That's about it for atheists. So if God does not exist, we're no more than accidental cosmic loafers. We're freaks of nature, glorified stardust, lost in space, awaiting death. As the universe is plunging toward decay, so is everything within it, including you and I. There's no escaping this given atheism. But we don't live our lives that way, do we? We live our lives as though there is meaning and purpose. We love, we learn, we forgive, as if these things really have a genuine meaning. We raise our children the same way, as if they have a purpose. At the end of the day, most of us, I would hope, evaluate our day and pay close attention to what really transpired meaningfully, as opposed to just going to work, call it a day, check in, check out. What really mattered today? What did we do to make a difference? And so forth. In the ultimate sense, we act as if there is some greater purpose, including hope, for the afterlife. We strive for immortality. At least that seems to be the case throughout most of human culture. In doing good things and focus on things that truly matter, that have meaning and impact. Now, Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist, claimed that life is meaningless. And we must assign meaning to our existence. Life is like a stage or a play with no ultimate meaning. There's no screenplay. There's no writer, no rhyme or reason whatsoever. So what do? We tighten our bootstraps and just march on. Life is terrible. According to Sartre, we pretend as if there is meaning. We assign meaning to our pathetic existence and sort of just go on like a bad movie. But this is purely fantasy. Even the atheist goes home and kisses his wife and kids as if there's meaning to that experience. If atheism is true, there's no ultimate meaning. Maybe a relative meaning, but no ultimate significance at all. At best, some vague notion of relative significance assigned to us by ourselves. So in the final analysis, were atheism true, we're no more significant really than a swamp of alligators or buzzing mosquitoes or, geese flying around. What makes us so special if atheism is true? For atheism, each of our lives will end up food for worms. Our destinies to become one with your casket, 6 feet below, and we're not pushing any daisies from the grave, that's for sure. But everyone we see, throughout cultures, people live their lives as if there is meaning and purpose and a real morality. Sartre writes, it is very distressing that God does not exist because, all the possibility of finding values are now gone. They disappear along with him. Like Nietzsche said, God is dead, and if so, so is all morality. There can no longer be an a priori, prior to looking at the facts, there can no longer be an a priori good since there is no infinite and perfect consciousness to think about it. There's no one out there to think it or think about it. There's no source of ultimate objective morality. We have to assign morality, meaning, and so forth. Therefore, what follows from the atheistic worldview is that there are no moral, intrinsic values. There's no meaning or purpose to life whatsoever. What are we referring to here? Theism makes more sense than atheism in justifying not just meaning, but an objective morality. Here's the argument in a syllogism. Premise 1, if God does not exist, then objective morality does not exist either. 2, objective morality does exist. Therefore, God exists. It sort of follows logically from the premises. But if atheism is true, what ethical system follows atheism? Moral relativism. If you want to do X, Y, and Z, who am I to judge? I personally wouldn't, as opposed to moral objectivism or moral absolutism, which would say, for example, rape is transculturally wrong. It was wrong 2,000 years ago. It'll be wrong 10,000 years from today. If there's a culture in the world that says, hey, we embrace infanticide or rape or cannibalizing on the homeless for the mere fun of it, torturing 2-year-olds for the mere fun of it, throwing gay guys off of buildings like ISIS does, beheading innocent people, to call those morally neutral acts is morally nuts and warped. Why? Because you have to say that they're morally neutral acts unless you buy into generalism, situation ethics, or some other notion of morality that's not part of the objective morality that I'm defending this evening. So for the theist, if you think about meaning, you think about morality, we can also add what philosophers call ought. There's an oughtness to the world. And that goes hand in hand with morality. You ought not to do X, Y, and Z. You ought not to go out and shoot the homeless for the mere fun of it. Things like that. These are moral abominations. There's an oughtness to the world. There's a certain way that things ought to be. And if there is an ought to the world, where does that come from? If it's just the result of a physical universe, there's no meaning, there's no purpose, we're just matter, atoms in motion, glorified stardust, if you will. There's no real morality. There's no oughtness to the world. There's not a certain way that things ought to be. And if you couple that with the problem of evil, like Hans Küng, the German theologian, he's called the problem of evil the big rock of atheism. Atheists tend to cling to the problem of evil. And that's sort of like the main milestone to argue from. If God exists, why is there so much evil in the world? But what's evil if God does not exist? A strawberry? A one-eyed bat? What is it? You have to presuppose an objective moral standard of right and wrong in order to argue against evil. If not, you'd have to say, well, these things are just morally neutral. In fact, morally illusory. And that doesn't have the ring of truth. I think that the Christian position, ranging from meaning to objective morality, actually saying that X is a moral abomination, you can't say that if you are a moral relativist. So the concept entails order, because you cannot have an ought without morality. And this oughtness comes from God. You know, philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche of Germany and Jean-Paul Sartre understood that if God is dead, then so is all morality. Therefore, I think on these 2 points alone, atheism is bankrupt when it comes to morality. This is not to say that atheists don't live moral lives. Of course they do. It's just, what are their reasons to do so, other than saying, well, I'm doing it because of sociobiological evolution says I ought to, or I should. You know, it's good for society. But then atheism really, in that notion of morality, aims at survival and sociology, not at a true ought. So Dostoevsky, the Russian, he said, if God does not exist, all things are permitted. You know, when you think of freaks like Ted Bundy, one of my former professors was lecturing at UNLV, and they had a relativist conference, and they thought, you know, let's have one of the objectivists come in and give a case against relativism. So he went up into the podium, and he quoted a relativist. And he says, let me open up with a quote. Maybe you've heard it, maybe you haven't. He says, all my education have led me to believe that there is no absolute standard or right and wrong, and just went down the line of the relativistic mindset when it comes to ethics. And he stops, unquote, and the audience starts clapping. Then he grabbed the mic and he said, yeah, Ted Bundy said that before his last victim. What he left out was this girl that he had in the car who was trying to get into his head. You know, why are you doing this? Let me get out of this. You know, maybe I can escape somehow by becoming his friend. At the end of that quote, he looked to the girl and says, you know what? Therefore, there's no difference between me having a steak or killing, raping, and eating you. And you hear a scream. As soon as my professor said that, the audience stopped clapping. Why such vivid and gross examples? Because when you're testing a system, you want to push it to its logical extreme. So by saying, hey, if moral relativism is true, and there is no God, and we sort of assign value equivalent to a speed limit, you know, we can change the speed limits up or down. But there's a moral principle behind that speed limit, which is what? Don't drive too fast because you could kill people, and killing people is wrong. Same thing with yield signs and stop signs. There's absolutely a moral principle behind it. Most people don't think of that, but there is. But you can still up or down the speed limit. Same thing driving an ambulance with somebody dying in the back seat, right? You can violate the speed limit in doing so. Why? Because life preserving is what we're after. That's praiseworthy. We value life more than the speed limit because the principle behind it is an objective moral law. So to argue morality based on secular humanism or mere social mores is no more than sociobiological evolution aiming at survival, which is not ethics, it is sociology. Next argument. Recent discoveries in astrophysics, cosmology, and biology, specifically DNA, make it more plausible to believe that there's a mind behind the universe as opposed to not. Premise one, an argument from cosmology. Whatever begins to exist requires a cause. If the universe had a beginning point, then it requires a cause. Big Bang cosmology seems to suggest that the universe began to exist. Well, then there must be a cause behind the universe. Who lit the match? If there was a Big Bang, who or what lit the match? I think that the rival hypotheses offered by scientists trying to explain away this principle don't work either. Could the universe be eternal? Well, if the universe is running out of energy and is expanding, and all of the causal events in the past are actually infinite or eternal, sun is shrinking, what, 5-6 feet per hour and so forth. The universe would have burned up in eternity ago if it was eternal. But we're here. Could the universe have created itself? Well, that's kind of circular. For the universe to create itself, it would have to exist prior to its own creation. So you haven't said much. You're back to it being eternal. What about the universe being in a steady state? American physicist Arno Penzias, who worked extensively on the Big Bang model, used to believe in the steady state model. He gave it up finally. He said it is just ugly. He says, quote, "The steady state theory turned out to be so ugly that people dismissed it. The easiest way to fit the observations with the least number of parameters was one which the universe was created out of nothing in an instant and continues to expand." Could the universe be in a continual oscillation, where it's oscillating, it's expanding and contracting and so forth? There simply is not sufficient mass in the universe to do so. And the force of gravity, the expansion rate, we know of no natural laws to ever pull it back. That's the rate of the expansion. But what about this question that always comes up when it comes to this argument? Anything that begins to exist requires a cause. 2, the universe began to exist. 3, therefore the universe was caused. Where did God come from then? I didn't say everything that exists requires a cause. We said anything that comes into being, or every effect has a cause. The universe is an effect, therefore requires a cause, if it is an effect, of course. To ask where God comes from or came from is a category error. Is asking the wrong question about the subject. It's like saying, what does the color blue smell like? Well, blue doesn't smell like anything, right? So the mistake here is, if you're asking questions about a being that is immortal, where did he come from? Well, you're missing the point. We believe that God is the uncaused cause that transcends the universe, which is finite. He's infinite, the universe is not. So, interestingly, some atheists, they have no problem in believing in an eternal, uncaused universe, but they can't believe in an eternal, uncaused cause who brought the universe into being. Whatever begins to exist requires a cause. A couple things here defending that premise. The law of causality, every effect requires a cause. Virtually most, if not all, of science rests on that principle. Whatever begins to exist in a scientific lab, you assume from the get-go that if I were to throw a bottle across the room, it will land somewhere. If I were to throw a pencil above this podium, and you don't see me, you just see a pencil fly, you're going to assume that someone threw the pen, because pens don't fly by themselves. Observation, repetition, and then prediction. Scientific method. We observe things, then we repeat things, and after repetition we can predict things. Such as, if I were to throw a pencil up in the air, it's not going to levitate and fly by itself. Right? So, forensically, when we're dealing with cosmology, it's really an exercise in forensic science. We weren't there to observe the Big Bang. We weren't there to observe the origin of the universe. And we're certainly not present now to experience black holes and parallel universes and multiverses and baby universes and all of these things. So we're kind of stuck. So what the theist does is we actually focus on what we are doing in the here and now, the scientific method, not scientism, I don't think that works, but the scientific method. And we're just saying, look, in the here and now, all effects have causes. Unless we want to talk about subatomic physics, and most people don't even have a clue about what's going on at that level. But that being said, what is wrong in saying everything that we experience here, all effects have causes? Well, let's go back 6,000, 10,000, 13.7 billion years, whatever you want to assign to it. If the universe had a beginning point, and it certainly looks that way, there must be a cause behind it. That's plausible. Defending premise 2, the universe began to exist. Scientists have confirmed that planets are moving away at rapid speeds, resulting from a great explosion some time ago. We already talked about that. Who lit the match? We can rephrase the argument. Again, every effect has a cause. The universe is an effect, therefore it requires a cause, and we call this cause God. Further, the universe is thinning out. Some call it burning out, indicating that the universe is finite as opposed to eternal. I already mentioned that if the series of causal events in the past, cause and effect is actually infinite, there would be no present moment. Al-Ghazali, who defended the Kalam cosmological argument, he says, if the series of events in the past are actually infinite, there would be no present moment. But here we are. I think it was Gottfried Leibniz, who was a German mathematician, in my view, smarter than Einstein. He said, the infinite is solely that of my idea. The infinite is nowhere to be found in nature, nor does it provide a legitimate basis for rational thought. It's solely that of an idea. What about virtual particles appearing or disappearing without a trace in a vacuum? Problem here is that the vacuum is not nothing, it's something. The vacuum and black holes are part of this universe. They're part of the entirety of the cosmos. So we can argue all night long about baby universes and so forth within this universe or parallel universes. We're talking about everything that we observe, everything that's out there. If it's an effect, it requires a cause, and this cause we call God. An argument from design. You could call this the teleological argument. You could call it argument from design. You can do all sorts of things with this. I will focus on DNA, biological truths, and some scientific points here. Number one, physical things require a designer. Two, the universe is a physical thing and more for the theist. Three, therefore the universe requires a designer. Or we could put it this way. Premise one, the universe is either fine-tuned, resulting from design, chance, or law, which would be natural law. It is not the result of chance or natural law. Three, therefore the fine-tuned universe is the result of design. Again, this is true of virtually everything that we observe. Why not the universe? When you see a car, you know there's a car manufacturer behind the design and the vehicle. There's a blueprint. Behind the blueprint is an engineer, and then they go to production. Why not the world? Why does design only apply to these things, but not to the universe? The intricate universe that you live in with all of its laws and details. Now, there are some things that seem out of whack, say disease and other things. But concerning what appears to be imperfect, we presuppose some notion of what is perfect. So for the theist, we live in a fallen universe. We live in a fallen world. That's why we see imperfection. And when you say things are imperfect or out of whack, you're presupposing that there's a standard of perfection, even though we may be unaware of what that is. You know, sort of like you can't say what's crooked, like C.S. Lewis said, unless you have an idea of what's straight. Same thing with an ought. Same thing with evil. And same thing with designs that appears to be out of whack. For example, DNA is not perfect. It's filled with information. Some 5,000 volumes of information in one single human cell. Darwin called it a simple cell. We know a lot more now about the cell. So if it's packed with information equivalent to 5,000 volumes, one cell, and you have billions of cells in your body, why would you just say no? Water bottles are made by man, but not the universe, not human beings, not animals. It makes little sense for the theist. So you could say, though, that the newest thing, so to speak, or more recent for the atheist movement, is to say that it's just an apparent design. Well, either it's designed or it's not. To argue that something is apparently designed due to maybe DNA having a breakdown, or DNA can be contaminated and so forth through disease or whatnot, that does not go against the theistic argument that it was designed. You can still have design, regardless of imperfections, because we live in a fallen world, and so forth. The specific amount of information contained in these things is so astronomically enormous that to explain away the designer is not just strange, but it's unconventional. We don't do that in a lab. Consider this one. One single sperm contains some 300 billion basis of genetic information. 300 billion. And that's what turned you into you. Not from goo to zoo to you. Consider your body. If you were able to lay down your arteries, the totality of your veins would stretch as far as 100,000 miles from just one single, enough to wrap the entire planet 4 times. But that was all chance. Molecules consisting of non-living matter cannot be transformed through natural and blind, unguided processes into organic proteins, the building blocks of life. It screams for a designer. And in order to arrange a protein sequence that actually works for important life, not just simple life, important life, the amino acids must be organized in an exact sequence or system. It's just slightly off. Like imagine a harp, playing a harp with a billion strings, and it's fine-tuned. If one is off key, this universe, including you and I, would cease to be. This ought to be a life-prohibiting world. The fact that it is a life-permitting planet is a miracle enough. Might as well give up atheism, because that alone is a miracle. C.S. Lewis put it well when he said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawmaker. Now, concerning the size and vastness of the universe, astrophysicist George Smoot at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory points out that in order for it to be that big, the size of the universe, you have to make it perfectly. Otherwise, the imperfections would mount up, and the universe would either collapse on itself or fly apart, and so it's actually a pretty precise job, unquote. Basic logic, science, and engineering demonstrate that you don't get information from non-information. There's information in DNA, there's information in your body, there's information in the world, there's information in natural law, there are mathematical truths that actually got us to the moon. We rely on these principles as we do in a lab. So you don't get mind from non-mind. You don't get intelligence from non-intelligence, as Rousseau put it. Quote, the visible order of the universe proclaims a supreme intelligence, unquote. When Leibniz said, why is there something rather than nothing at all? This is what philosophers have been, sought to answer for a long, long time. Millennia. Why is there something rather than nothing at all? If the universe came from nothing by nothing, that takes more faith than to believing that there's a cause behind it. The ratio of electromagnetic force constant to the force of gravity is perfect. The expansion rate of the universe, the velocity of light, the age of the cosmos, the initial uniformity of radiation, the average distance between stars, the ratio of electrons and proton mass, all of these things, if they were slightly off, life would cease to exist. In short, mathematical truths, logical truths like the law of non-contradiction, A does not equal non-A. We rely on these mathematical principles. They're not real as far as being part of this physical universe. They're not materia, like the Latins would say. It's not matter. Numbers are still as real as you are in this room. You couldn't even utter a sentence unless you presuppose the laws of logic, which is information. We believe that mathematical principles flow from the nature of the theistic God. The same thing with the laws of logic. Aristotle did not invent them. He discovered them. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Eddie Tabash will now give his 30-minute opening statement.
Melissa, can you hold the cards up a little longer? Thank you. Well, I want to thank Nick and the church for arranging this debate. I will respond to Nick's specific arguments in my rebuttal, but now I'm going to set forth arguments for why I maintain the overwhelming weight of the evidence in our universe demonstrates that it is more likely than not that God does not exist. I will argue that the evidence in our physical universe makes it more unlikely that there does not exist the standard issue, all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing deity. First argument is the lack of evidence of anything beyond the physical. One of my themes will be the lack of evidence of the supernatural and the clear indication from the physical world that the supernatural does not exist. Thus, God is swept away with all supernatural claims. My argument is based on the weight of the evidence and upon the assertion that atheism is the best inference to be made from the existing evidence. As this debate progresses, I want everybody to keep in mind the following criteria for assessing the relative strengths of our competing arguments. Argument number 2, the God of the gaps. No basis for asserting a supernatural being because we haven't yet found a naturalistic answer when there is no otherwise existing independent evidence of the supernatural. In order to prevail in this debate, Nick must show that his supernatural explanations are better than naturalistic explanations. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. His burden is the same as one who asserts that it is most likely that the noise in the attic is caused by space aliens who can make themselves invisible whenever they want from a planet in the Andromeda Galaxy, after we have heard substantial commotion in the attic, and each time we inspect the attic, can't find the source of that commotion. The fact that there is undisputed commotion in the attic, along with the fact that we cannot determine the causative agencies for that ruckus, still does not justify a leap to a paranormal explanation. The analogy, I argue, applies to all claims of God did it. Nick will also have to show that a supernatural God is a more likely explanation than a non-supernatural explanation for each of the arguments that I'm about to present and for each of his arguments. The fact that we can't prove that there are absolutely no space aliens in the attic causing the noise does not mean that we now have good evidence that those space aliens are making that noise. So I will ask you to keep in mind this additional question, and that is my argument number 3, which is more consistent with the observed facts of our physical world, when there is no evidence of anything paranormal that is operative beyond the physical world, the natural explanation or the supernatural one. For purposes of our debate tonight, I will ask you to never drop the analogy of the invisible space aliens, because it directly conforms to the same problem of the invisible, paranormal, supernatural God. My point number 4, we have no obligation to justify our disbelief in something unless there is sufficient evidence to believe it. I don't have to justify, to quote Bertrand Russell, my lack of belief that there is currently a ceramic teapot orbiting Jupiter. I don't have to prove this is not true. Now, the theist burden that must be met and overcome is first show that a disembodied immaterial mind without a functional brain created the physical world and controls it. Then he has to demonstrate how that mind with no material components created matter and the physical world, and what was the mechanism to demonstrate how the actions of this immaterial mind, a supernatural being with no physical attributes itself, are a more likely explanation for any occurrence or condition in the universe, even those which we don't yet have answers for. There is a problem, point number 6, of supernatural claims generally. If I said that years ago here in ancient Anaheim that green gremlins from the 6th dimension abducted members of the native population and imbued them with special powers, and this is why Disneyland located here, you wouldn't believe me. And you wouldn't believe me because these gremlins violate the laws of nature as we understand them. Now, let's draw an analogy here. Nick is inferring from things in the universe that a supernatural being exists. But let me show you an analogy that stays within the framework of the scientific empirical method. Though we've never seen a quark, we know that the category of subatomic particles do exist. Evidence for the existence of quarks have been steadily increasing. One indication of the soundness of the quark model is its success in predicting the outcome of high energy collisions of an electron and a positron. So there is empirical verification that they exist, even though we don't observe them directly within what we already know about the natural physical universe. Again, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. There's a problem with claims of miracles. Claims of miracles have the initial problem of bearing witness against themselves, since by their very nature they are violations of the very laws of nature that are not supposed to be violated. All the supposed miracles that are used to verify the intervention in human affairs of this all-powerful God took place in a pre-scientific era. Why don't they happen today? We don't ever see a talking donkey. We don't see worldwide floods. We don't see the sun standing still. We don't see talking snakes, though some people attribute that to members of my profession. And yet none of this occurs. There is a story that God turned somebody into a pillar of salt. We'll do that today. Do some miracle today, which will lead into my later argument from divine hiddenness. The probability that a miracle happened, a violation of natural law, will always be lower than the probability that a miracle has not occurred, as Scottish philosopher David Hume famously said that a miracle claim must be more plausible than the assertion that the miracle did not happen. Now, a very strong argument against anything that a God without a physical body could even do, could even think, is the argument from physical minds. Now, if we have Alzheimer's or even an anesthetic, our brains don't function, we don't have our consciousness. Let's take somebody who, at the moment of their birth, is kept for 70 years with no language, just fed and hydrated, and kept chemically alive, never spoken to, and never hears a human language, human word, and then pops out into the life after death, which Nick says we yearn for. Well, who comes out into the hereafter? Somebody who speaks a language, who understands things. Everything we know comes through physical senses into a physical brain. And now I'm going to use what I consider a great accomplishment on the part of my friend Nick to argue further that physical brains are necessary for learning and consciousness and awareness. He came here as a teenager from Sweden and learned to speak English like a native. Nobody listening to him can tell he wasn't born here. Usually kids who learn a language when they move to another country come much younger than he did. However, he could not have learned English without the contents and forms of the language entering a functional physical brain with operative cortical neurons and synapses through the physical senses of seeing and hearing. He couldn't have learned language. He couldn't have even learned how to make the arguments he made tonight without a physical brain and sensory input into the physical brain. So there would have been no way that pure spirit without cortical neurons and synapses can display consciousness, and if there is, we need to see evidence of that. Also, if our models of self-conscious aware beings are those with physical brains, and we are indeed made in God's image, then based on the model of consciousness and brains we derive from our own experience as sentient beings, how can we be expected to believe in and conceive of mind without the attributes of consciousness and our empirical experience that shows dependence of consciousness on the physical brain? How can God think? How can God impact the physical? How can God cause nature to come about and sustain it if God can't think, because God can't think without physical neurons and synapses? And if God can do it, how does he do it? The connection between disembodied mind and impacting the physical world, let alone creating it, must be explained. And that is one of the key problems with all supernatural claims and all claims that a disembodied mind can be antecedent to all we know and all that exists. Now, there comes the problem from evil. Now, Nick is not basing his argument tonight on a God of the Bible. However, I'm asserting that the defects and problems with the Bible, whatever Nick is arguing, is an independent atheistic argument against God's existence, which I will explain later. So, for instance, in Isaiah 46, 9 through 11, God says he wants whatever happens, happens. And then he later says, I make peace and I create evil. Well, why is one child born in a Bangladeshi mud hut and the other born in an upscale American neighborhood? Now, there was no benefit to my mother's experiences in Auschwitz. I grew up as her son. I can testify to that. You want to say, well, did it mold her character? No, it didn't. It broke her. So why not give people a boot camp to improve our character and stiffen our spines as opposed to a concentration camp? Malaria is a terrible disease. There is a gene, though, that provides an effective defense against malaria. It works by destroying any red corpuscles that have been occupied by any of the types of parasitic protozoans that cause malaria. But if one has inherited this gene from both parents, it causes sickle cell anemia. Now, God does not adequately comfort suffering. He's too harsh with us. The distribution of disease and pain is in no way related to the virtue of the afflicted. Also, how can God be all-knowing and unchanging with respect to his views on what evil is and what it is not if he changes his mind? Exodus 32:14, and the Lord repented of the evil which he sought to do unto his people. But you see, if he is almighty, and then he can change his mind. But if he's all-knowing, he can't change his mind because he always knew what he was going to do, so he can't repent. And if Nick says, well, I'm not then arguing the God of the Bible, he has to show us where else revelations have been lodged so we can find them, including those of morality. Now, to explain evil, a theist must argue that God, with his unlimited power, could not have prevented an even greater evil, but for the horrible evil he actually caused or allowed when he could have stopped it, or with his unlimited power, he could not have brought about a very great good, but for actually causing or allowing a horrible evil. This is a very high hurdle for an omnipotent being to meet if we really take omnipotence seriously. Further, an all-powerful and all-good God would have to have a morally sufficient reason for allowing or causing any suffering. If we are to believe that an all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful deity exists, that deity should directly explain to us why, with unlimited power, this being still allowed the egregious suffering in question. Then, as a subset of the argument from evil, is the flourishing and languishing of sentient beings. We only have a few decades of good health and particularly physical vigor, and then we decline. Now, there are countless living organisms, including sentient beings, who never flourish. And there are people who live in poverty their entire lives, and other sentient living beings who live in squalor. And that's not what we would expect if the world is created by a perfect God. Also, another subset of the argument from evil is how pain and pleasure operate. It can be argued that some pain is necessary in order for people to be alerted to various dangers, such as the pain of fire alerting us to call the fire department to hopefully rescue us before we perish in the flames. But now consider the pain suffered by an innocent person who is burned to death by members of ISIS just for not holding the religious beliefs that ISIS approves of. Such pain is not biologically useful in that it doesn't contribute to someone's survival or reproduction. If theism were true, we would expect a benevolent deity to shield us from such unnecessary suffering by fine-tuning our capacity for agony to be activated only if such horrendous pain served a purpose to aid in the individual's survival or reproduction. On atheistic naturalism, we would expect there to be no relief from agonizing pain, even if such pain were not useful, as the evolution by natural selection is indifferent to human suffering in a way that we would not expect God to be. Now, there's the argument from evolution, though many theists believe in evolution, because of its sloppiness and trial and error features, evolution by natural selection is more likely if there is no God, because of all the blind alleys it runs into and its wasteful way of groping for the descendants and what occurs. More than 99% of all species that have existed are now extinct. This is wasteful. We have useless components to our bodies, and indeed that do more harm than good, like the appendix. Evolution by natural selection is established by the weight of evidence thus far in our physical world. For instance, the 100% match of DNA sequence in the pseudogene region of beta globin is proof that humans and gorillas shared a common ancestor. Not that we evolved directly one from the other, but shared a common ancestor. Now, a lot of what I have been presenting raises the question that we human beings with our rational minds have a right to expect that if there were a God, that God would reveal certain things so that belief in him wouldn't be so difficult. This is the argument from divine hiddenness or non-resistant belief, which is that we have a right to expect a God that wants relationship with us to give us enough direct evidence and not to give us defective revelations and never answering questions about evil, because these unanswered questions, which cause many of us to not believe in a God, is more consistent with there not being a God that wants relationship with us than one that does want relationship. Now, God did not comfort my paternal grandmother as the Lithuanian militia acting for the Nazis were about to shoot her into a pit that she was forced to dig. God didn't comfort my maternal grandfather as he was about to be shoved into the gas chamber in Auschwitz. And if God provides such comfort, God should let everyone know in advance that this comfort will be coming to everyone about to undergo a horrible death, so that we don't have additional beliefs, reasons not to believe in him. And why is God so inaccessible to us except by ancient hearsay? Why so many different religions? Why not a simulcast in every language of the world with some guidance? A supernatural voice booming from the heavens? I couldn't believe in God even if I wanted to. However, if this podium turned into green mist and right now the roof blew off this church and Nick and I were elevated 1,000 feet above Anaheim with all sorts of flashing lights and booming voices, I might turn to him and say, Nick, I might be on the verge of conceding the debate. But that's not going to happen. We know it's not going to happen. There are no miraculous events, which there should be, if God wants us to be in relationship with him. And to say, well, God has to keep a distance so as not to impinge on our free will. Well, no. The more information we have, the more we know. In no other situation do we say, let's keep people in the dark so they have greater free will. The more information you have, the more you can have informed decisions. So the evidence of our world strongly suggests that we live in a vast and indifferent universe. And we will get into all the problems with the Bible. Now, I said that the Bible is an independent argument against God's existence, whether Nick decides to defend Christianity or not. They're separate issues. Here's why. As an extension of the argument from divine hiddenness and the argument from religious confusion, we would expect a God who wants relationship with us to give us a revelation that we could rely on. But Genesis got so many things wrong. Plants did not come into existence without materials that come from the stars exploding a supernova. Yet the planets existed before. We have the sun standing still. We know that didn't happen. All sorts of atrocities in the Bible. There is an area where Moses is armies were told to kill all the non-virgins in a city and keep the virgins for themselves and discard them later if unpleasing. So that means that the God of the Bible condoned rape. Also, the argument from religious confusion. Why is it that so many sincere people have so many different ideas about what religion should be? Why is it that the Bible is so confusing? And if it's not in the Bible, where else does God locate his definitive revelation so that these question marks that create doubt and lead to non-belief wouldn't exist? Now, Nick is not defending the Christian God, but the claim that there is a Christian God is itself is a reason not to believe, because it shows a defect in the Bible. For instance, if Jesus and God were one, then Jesus was crying out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? He was really saying, me, why have I forsaken myself? Which would have been pretty schizophrenic. Now, what about people who undergo what we could know as religious experience? There is an argument against God's existence from the inconclusiveness of religious experience because it leads nowhere. People have different impressions. The Dalai Lama meditates deeply and believes there's a cosmic mush that loves everybody. A Christian mystic may come back with another sense of something. If there is a God that wants us to know him and know his will, then that God should reveal the same story to everybody who goes into a mystical state. Also, if there is a God who wants us to be able to connect with him during a religious experience or mystical state, they should be veridical, and they should have evidence in them of contacting something beyond the physical. They don't. First of all, science has shown you can manipulate certain parts of the brain and induce the same types of experiences as mystical experiences. You can take psychedelic drugs and have the same types of experiences. Also, regardless of how lofty religious experiences are, you couldn't have them without a functional physical brain. So if there is a God, we would expect a uniform veridical experience that would accompany mystical states so that we could connect with this being, unless it's really trying to hide from us, which would make no sense. Then we have the argument from moral confusion. If there is a God who wants us to know its will, then that God would not allow us to be so confused about what it really wants. So Nick says he's not going to argue the God of the Bible. Okay, then I'm going to say that gay sex is fine and that we should all support the right of gay adults to have sex. But there are many people who claim to believe in God who disbelieve in this. Well, where do we find a reliable answer that we can trust? There are all sorts of dilemmas today: abortion, capital punishment, when we should go to war, when we shouldn't. In Romans chapter 13, we are ordered to support the government that is in power. Does this mean that religious conservatives who tried to bring down Bill Clinton when he was president violated this biblical command? When should someone go to jail for something? When should that which is immoral become illegal? We have no basis for determining these things, and many people of goodwill have vastly differing answers. And because of the vastly differing answers, there is too much confusion than what we would expect for a God who wants us to know his will. Then there's the argument from scale and the argument from human insignificance. Well, Nick says that the vastness of the universe would be evidence of God's existence. The opposite, I would say, is true. 96% of the universe is dark matter. There are septillions and septillions of planets. Why is it that if there is a God to whom we are central, that there is so much unnecessary debris floating around, so many unnecessary billions of galaxies and planets. And if we are not central to God's existence, but one of only 50 trillion inhabited planets where God is trying to save the residents, does this mean that a Savior has to be sent to all 50 trillion and die on that planet in order for its inhabitants to be saved? And so we don't even know our place in the universe. But if there is a God who wants us to know him, we should know that place. Then there is the argument against God's existence because of the improbability of a transcendent person. A person is by very definition a being who thinks and performs actions, and in turn requires to be in time. So how could God have deliberately created anything if there wasn't a context of time in which he had no choice but to operate? If we appeal to some pre-time time, as we know it, meta-time, then we are speaking about something mysterious that does not correspond to our understanding that all personal beings operate in time as we know. If the theist says that God can exist and function in some unknowable meta-time, for which, of course, there is no proof, and which is something made up ad hoc without any evidence, then the theist is conceding that God is not completely transcendent. A transcendent being has to act in time in order to cause our universe to come into existence. A transcendent being has to act in time in order to provide the necessary state of affairs of our universe. But how does a transcendent being that is outside of time even know time or enter into it? So it is a contradiction, not a logical contradiction, but I think an evidential contradiction to say that God is a transcendent being and yet is a personal being. Also, if in fact there are immaterial souls whose existence do not depend on the physical body, what kind of afterlife could it mean? Would it mean that one soul falls into another because there are no boundaries? How do we tell one from the other? How could consciousness be transferred from the physical brain into a disembodied setting? The mechanisms aren't even there for disembodied mind to exist, and if they were there, then all the evidence shouldn't point to the fact that we can only have functional consciousness in any form if there's a physical brain. So if you look at the totality of the physical evidence in our universe, it's far more likely than not the universe is natural and not supernatural, and no God or other disembodied intelligence exists. Thank you.
I'd like to remind the audience there are index cards and pens on which to write your questions on the pews in the first few rows. So please come forward and write your question. We'll have a time of question and answer later on in the debate. We'll now have a time of rebuttal. Nick Keehus, you have 15 minutes for your rebuttal.
We need 3 hours to address all of our concerns tonight. That's a lot of stuff. I won't address everything. I will address the points that I think are mostly important. Eddie decided to bring in biblical theology, citing various verses from the Tanakh or the Old Testament, including Romans, so we can go there too. But I will do so selectively to stay close to the topic, which is, does God exist? Not necessarily Moses, and immateriality, and so forth. He argues that there is lack of evidence above the physical realm. You know, all we see is physicalism. I beg to differ. If I were to say to my wife, I love you, you can't prove love in a test tube. If I were to say 8 plus 8 equals 16, you can't prove that in a test tube. Numbers are symbols representing concepts that I don't believe just reside in the brain. I don't go with the view that all truths are produced by the brain. I would be more in line with Thomas Aquinas, Thomism, that we have pre-existing souls, okay? Or you could say, put it this way, if you go with the view known as traducianism. Traducianism is the idea that within theistic circles, the physical body, DNA and so forth, including the soul, since we're going there, is transmitted through the parents. So it's not like some of the old theologians used to say that maybe there's a soulish factory up there, and whenever a baby is conceived, God throws a soul in there. No, I go with the tradition view that both soul and human DNA is transferred through the parents. Now, that being said, when you look at numbers, for example, the number 8. If I draw an 8 on a board in a classroom and I ask you, what is that? You will say, that's 8. And I will say, no, that's a symbol of the concept of eightness, because symbols differ. A Chinese version of 8 looks very different from our version. Same with Japanese and so forth. So the symbols are different, representing the same concept. So if I were to say, for example, did 2 plus 2 equal 4 prior to human beings existing? I'm of the view that yes, it would equal 4. If we all drank cyanide and died in 6 minutes, the entire planet, is it still true that 2 plus 2 equals 4? Well, some of you might say no. I'm going to say yes. So these logical truths don't float around by themselves in the universe. I believe, again, going back to Thomas Aquinas now, that there's an innate knowledge, part of the mind, not part of the brain. The mind can be conscious as well. And now you're dealing with issues of resurrections. For example, you wanted to argue biblical theology. John 2:19, Jesus says, destroy this body. He was referring to his body. Destroy this temple. In 3 days I will raise it up. What happened if you want to go with biblical theology? Well, he was dead for 3 days, spiritually conscious on the other side of death, because he can't raise his own carcass unless he's on the other side of the grave. So destroy this body in 3 days, I will raise it up. The Greek word for body there is soma. I will raise it up. It's the same body. So on the other side of death, he's spiritually conscious, which is part of the mind. He raised his physical body and moved on. So math, love, logic, these are immaterial truths that I think are just as real as this room. We presuppose these things. Even the scientist who says philosophy is for the birds, he engages in philosophical reasoning prior to his scientific method. What led you to the truth that you can only know truth according to scientism? Well, loss of logic. There you go. Loss of logic are not part of the scientific method, if you will. Atheists need not justify their atheism. I think they do. I didn't want to go there this evening because atheists are not necessarily my opponent this evening, but they're splitting hairs. Atheos, a in Greek is negating theos, which is God. Theos, atheos. You can really say it's anti-theism. You can say it's anti-theos. It's without God. It's no Godism. So when you're making a claim that there is no Godism, you need to defend that claim. I don't think the burden of proof is solely on me. The moment you say something about reality or ultimate reality, you need to defend that point. Not offensively, you need to defend it. If I claim God exists, I need to give some arguments for it. If you say God does not exist, you need to give some arguments against God's existence. And I think that's where we're going. And so the burden of proof is not solely on me. How did a spiritual mind create the physical world? Again, I would say here that the mind is not physical. I already touched on that. How could God do so if it doesn't have a brain? Well, I can say that if this being is immaterial and the mind is part of this immaterial being, you can have an immaterial being outside of the universe that possesses things like volition and will. If you look at the Kalam argument we touched on earlier, anything that begins to exist requires a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore it requires a cause. Okay, theists believe that at that moment when God created the universe, he created energy, matter, time, right then and there. And so that would require will. If God were to say, I'm going to create the universe right now, that moment would be the first moment because time was created. It tells me that this being must possess attributes like volition, a choice to create the world at this moment as opposed to other moments, and it also requires power. So I don't think I see a problem with a spiritual agent, a personal agent, possessing these attributes could actually create matter. Miracles are violations of the laws of nature, he says. I go with the view that the laws of nature are descriptive. They're not prescriptive. Okay? To say that the laws of nature are absolutely fixed assumes the uniformitarian view of nature. You'd have to be everywhere in the universe at the same time for all millennia since the origin of the universe to make that claim. I'm not saying that God is violating the laws of nature. He created the laws of nature. He's not subject to them. But I can also say that based upon what we observe, we can say, yeah, they appear fixed, or we can say that they are descriptive, but I'm not going to say that they are prescriptive. No miracles are happening today. Well, I tend to differ. Certainly maybe not here in the West, in the Western world. But if you look at, say, for example, some of the radical Muslim countries around the world. Some of these Muslims that are not being reached by various missionaries of whatever faith, they're now claiming to have visions of Jesus and all sorts of bizarre dreams that I did not used to believe in. I used to be skeptical of that, but the experiences are sort of getting to be overwhelming, They're adding up. There's story after story after. Why would you give up Islam? Well, I have the vision of Jesus. He showed up in my room. Now, that hasn't happened to me. If that happened to someone in Saudi Arabia, good for them. In previous debates, Edward Tabash would argue against exorcism. And it sort of goes hand in hand with the thing of that the universe is just a physical property. There's nothing spiritual within it. I studied exorcism in Rome. And I was in a room with 169 priests. These guys are not out to flaunt their stories. They're not first-page news. They don't stress their trade. They're very, I'm not going to say secretive about it, but it's not a popular profession. Most priests don't want to do it. Most people don't want to study this stuff. I got frustrated with my books on systematic theology written by Protestants, so I said I got to go over there and really get demonology on steroids, sort of chew the fruit and spit out the seeds, and I did, and I got some answers. We could say foaming of the mouth is produced by, some chemical imbalance or something in the brain, but what you can explain is a 5-year-old girl in Peru levitating off the floor. You can't explain how, say, I'm not gonna allude to real stories because we're supposed to keep them within that room, but let's say you have an American girl living in Fountain Valley, and people just schizophrenia, multiple personality disorder, and so forth, and so let's give her pills. Well, say the family are devout Catholics. Protestants would probably send them to Dr. Phil, but most Catholics would say, call the priest. So the priest shows up, and what happens? There's an aversion to the sacred. They don't like crosses. They don't like holy water. None of these things. And then this girl from Fountain Valley starts cursing at the priest fluently in Latin. Why? Well, languages are earned, just like Eddie was saying. I had to pick up this language and more. So languages are earned. You just don't, there's not something in your brain that's going to help you speak Latin or French or cursing at a priest in Hebrew or whatever. You can't explain levitation. You can't explain cursing at the priest in a different language unknown to the possessed. So I would consider that a miracle. I would consider that a healing. And then if they leave, meaning the possession is successful after the exorcist walks in, that's a miracle. There are reports of these things worldwide. Maybe not in Hollywood, maybe not in Surf City, because maybe we are already so close-minded to these things. Third world countries, these things tend to happen. There's more to the brain than merely the physical. I already said that. There's a mind. Immateriality is part of the soul, and logic is part of that. You know, one thing I wanted to mention is within the mind, which is part of the soul, and these are difficult things to talk about. What in the world is a mind? What is a soul? If it's immaterial, what kind of materiality is immateriality? I see the problem there. We don't know everything yet. We don't, but we're going to talk about parallel universes, and maybe Jesus is going to die for sinners on another planet. We might as well say, hey, there's a soul and there's a mind, and part of that mind has innate knowledge. So once the brain starts to develop, the child can actually recognize when mom or dad walks into the room. They don't confuse these things. I believe that the laws of logic are already part of the innate mind of a child. And then once the brain starts to develop, the two work hand in hand. What happens when we die? Will our souls merge with other souls? Well, I'll go with biblical theology on that view. You will be reunited with your soul at the resurrection, which happens at the end of time. That would be the biblical mainstream view, I should say. And that goes for Judaism as well. At the end of the age, I'm not talking last days madness. I'm talking at the end of the world, at the end of the age. And the age began a long time ago. There will be a resurrection of all bodies. Let's see here. I create evil, Isaiah 46. That can also be translated calamity. You know, again, we're back to the problem of evil. The atheist, when he brings up the problem of evil, he believes evil is real. But again, if God does not exist, nor do objective moral values. But objective moral values do exist. Why? Because some things are really evil. For example, my opponent's mother surviving Auschwitz. Absolutely horrible. I get it. And he's got a real, there's a tone of condemnation, and rightly so. But if atheism is true and relativism prevails, who are we to say to the Nazis that you are wrong at the Nuremberg trial? Which is exactly what was their defense. Who are you to come in here and push down your moral values down our throat? When the U.S. showed up with the Italians and French and whoever else. Who are you? We got our own set of values. Don't force your objectivism on me. What did we say? We answer to a higher law, a natural law, a moral law that's above your pathetic law. That's what we told the Nazis. So I think that evil in this sense is indirect proof that God does exist. Pain and suffering, you know, evil, pain and suffering, well, the Judeo-Christian view, that would really be it for theism. Islam doesn't qualify for being a theistic religion. God is too arbitrary. He lies, but he lies perfectly. So we could toss that one out. But if Judaism is true and Christianity is true, from a Christian standpoint, we could say that if Christianity is true, it's a fulfillment of Judaism. So now you got Judeo-Christian theism. And he was citing from the Old and the New Testament there. Evil will one day be done away with. If God has logically possible, let's just say, is it possible for God to have good reasons unknown to us for allowing pain and suffering? Sure it is. But he will end it one day. Secondly, we live in the West. Here in the West, we think all pain is bad. Pain is bad. Pain is in the Middle East, no. We learn from pain. We grow with pain. Third, we live in a fallen world. The world is screwed up. And we know it. There's something broken about ourselves, about the body, something that's in need of repair. We call that oughtness. That's part of the design. Fallen world. He's not responsible. We chose that. Thank you.
Eddie Tabash, you now have 15 minutes for your rebuttal.
You see, one of the key problems with Nick's approach to defending the supernatural and the paranormal without sufficient evidence is what he just told us about exorcisms. It is far more likely than not that priests in Rome will pretend to be hush-hush about it to make it look like they're so humble that they don't even want to talk about it, just to make it more likely. But there is no proof whatsoever of demonic possession. And here is another problem. How does an entity without a physical body and brain possess another entity? What is the mechanism? Also, how large is a demon? If a demon is 15 feet wide, can the demon possess two people who are standing next to each other? And in terms of, he mentioned one debate about something in Germany about a possessed young girl walking sideways up a wall. That's all fine if we could prove it and see it. In the early 80s, in my New Age days, a medical doctor from India told me that it is his home in West Los Angeles. He and 5 of his friends saw their guru, who just came for a visit from India, levitate to the ceiling. If I don't see it myself and I don't put my hand above the guy to make sure there are no wires pulling him up, I have no obligation to believe it. There's absolutely nothing that Nick said about the veridical claim that possession occurs that constitutes proof. Now, with respect to his argument from morality and his claim that we can't have objective moral values without God. First of all, he assumes that God is necessary for objective moral values, but does not explain how that comes about. Also, if Nick doesn't want to defend the Bible, he has to show us where God has lodged these objective moral values for us to find them and know what they are, if not the Bible. And if God has lodged them in the Bible, then God's atrocities in the Bible are such that we can't believe that God has an objective basis for moral values. Now, if each of God's commands, are they necessitated by his moral nature? Does that mean that it was impossible for him to give us commands other than those he gave us? Could he have said in the book of Exodus, rather than thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, let the witches do what they want, they're fine, they're not hurting anybody? Could he have said in the book of Leviticus, gay sex, that's nothing, let them do what they want as long as they're happy? So you see, we also have the Euthyphro Dilemma. Is something good just because God says it's good, which means it's arbitrary based on God, and you look at what he did in the Bible, ordering the Amalekites to be killed, women captives to be raped, whole races wiped out, a flood taking out everybody, including innocent children. You look at all of that and you say, well, no, we don't have to accept that. We have an innate moral sense based on our biological nature that tells us these things are wrong. Now, someone can say, well, God created us so he can do whatever he wants with us, even torturing us. No, because you see, if I create a race of sentient robots, they're my creation, but I have no right to make them suffer unnecessarily. So creating someone doesn't justify harming them or torturing them. And then if things are not morally true just because God says them, but there is a moral standard independently of God that God is able to determine, then we already have an independent basis of morality other than God. Now, if you want to say that there is a third prong and that things are good because they emerge from God's perfect nature, you have to first prove that that nature exists and that it is perfect. You just can't assert it. And then once again, you have the problem that you had with the conduct of God in the Bible, with all the atrocities. Now, another problem is this, is that if all moral commands come from God, that means that unless they come from God, that they can't be known or done and don't have moral values. So let's say that we could say, all we have to do is lift a finger and stop the Holocaust. But God never told us that was a necessary thing to do or we should do it. And we don't know God's view on that. Does that mean now that lifting a finger to stop the Holocaust has lost its value and its moral impetus because we haven't heard from God. And also to say that God is good and God is the fount of moral values must be morally significant. But it's not morally significant if it's a tautology. If we say God commands us to do the good and whatever God commands is automatically good, then what we're saying is God commands us to do what God commands us to do, which becomes meaningless. With respect to Nick's position on the first cause argument, the Kalam cosmological argument, he doesn't tell us how God did it or the process by which God can do anything without being a physical being. Also, for purposes of tonight's debate, I'm going to happily concede that the universe began with the Big Bang. However, if the universe began with the Big Bang, time and space began with the Big Bang, because everything began with the Big Bang. Thus, we can't even speak of a cause of the universe, because time and space did not precede the universe. So for A to cause B, there has to be a context of time and space, and there is no time and space, so we cannot say that if the universe had a beginning, that it had a physical, and it exists, that it had a cause outside of the physical realm, which means in our current knowledge we can't even attribute cause to it, because time and space began with the Big Bang. Also, an alternative, which is still more plausible than theism, is that we can't get back to the Big Bang. It's a model, not an actual event, and that there was a process of quantum foam on quantum mechanics, and Nick would say, well, where did that come from? Well, I can say, where does God come from? Nick says that that is an impermissible question because God is automatically defined as already having existed. He can't presuppose that. He has to prove it. Now, with respect to his fine-tuning argument from design, there are a number of problems with the whole issue of fine-tuning, and it begins with this, is if in fact God is all-powerful and can do anything, why is fine-tuning even an issue? Because God could make us live in water, so why would God even have to fine-tune anything? In addition to that, if God does not have to fine-tune anything, it doesn't matter what these parameters might be. Also, if in fact God is this all-powerful being and can literally do anything, then God doesn't even need the laws of physics. Therefore, given that the laws of physics apply, it is more likely on atheism than on theism, because on theism we wouldn't need laws of physics, but on atheism we do, and we have proof that they work. Also, Nick mentioned that there are all these constants that couldn't vary at all. Well, yes, they can. It's not as tightly wound. Steve Weinberg, a physics Nobel laureate, talks about how there can be a 20% difference in the electron volt and still would not cause a collapse. And then also, it was published in Scientific American, that you can eliminate the weak force, one of the four cosmic forces, and you will still have sufficient substituting for hydrogen by deuterium, which would only make water heavier. And then the fine structured constant known as alpha was measured about 300 distant galaxies, and there could be a great variance in it, and the stars could still form. Now, Professor Fred Adams of University of Michigan wrote in Stars and Other Universes, Stellar Structures, that the nuclear reaction rates, even if they function only 1/4 of their current parameter space and still permit stars to be operational by way of nuclear fusion, stars could still form and then explode as supernova. So And then the other problem with the fine-tuning argument is the inexplicable question of why an all-powerful being would in the first place make the universe teeter so precariously that the slightest alteration of anything would make it collapse. You wouldn't find a computer programmer creating a computer program that is so tinderbox that the moment you touch anything, it falls apart. Why would God make something so close to the edge where it's about to collapse at any moment? Now, Nick, in his opening statement, talked about the ultimate meaning of life. Life would be meaningless if we ended death. That's not an argument for God's existence. It is an argument that maybe we would be happier and better off if there were a God. But the topic tonight is not, would we be better off with a God? The topic is, does God exist? Now, he talks about the laws of logic and mathematics, but they count against theism because they are so inherent in existence that no mind, divine or otherwise, could alter them. So the fact that 2 + 2 = 4 could never be changed by anyone, that holds even under any circumstances. Once we define 2 and once we define 2, once we define 4, they are inviolable. And because they are inviolable, they don't depend on any mind, including the mind of God. And this is a very, very important point. Now, he mentions abstract concepts like love and like numbers. They don't require supernatural existence. The Platonic existence of numbers, like the number 3, which correspond to 3 objects, does not in any way mean that those Platonic abstract entities by themselves have separate consciousness that is disembodied. So we're all capable of having great love for people, but the love itself, even if it's an abstract concept, is not self-conscious without a body and brain. We, with our brains, are conscious of the love that we feel. Now, he talks about mind not coming from non-mind. We're getting very close, and on naturalism, this is more likely than on atheism, on theism. Going back to the 1953 Miller-Urey experiment, where amino acids, many of which constitute proteins, were created in a flask. And then recently at the Scripps Institute, we're almost at the point, right on the verge, of recreating ancient pre-DNA RNA, which was the first forms of mechanism of life precursor and life enabler from which DNA emerged. Also, once again, now that we have this, we can see how it's possible that inorganic matter became organic material without the intervention of a supernatural being. And then again, with respect to the argument from evil, since I was able to demonstrate that a supernatural being is not the fount of our understanding of moral values, you don't need, common sense and daily experience tells us, you don't need to believe in a deity in order to know the Holocaust was wrong. You don't have to believe in a supernatural being to know that the claimed atrocities perpetrated by the God in the Old Testament are wrong. You don't need a deity to tell you so that you can reliably comprehend that torturing innocent people is wrong. You don't need a deity to tell you that ISIS throwing people off of buildings just because they're gay is wrong. So these moral comprehensions are inherent on our evolving sense of decency, and in fact, the more we evolve morally, the more we get away from the strictures and punishments of ancient fundamentalist religions. So again, the universe is natural, not supernatural. God does not exist. Thank you.
We'll now have a time of question and answer. If you have questions, could you please pass them forward quickly? Okay, the first question is for Nick Keehus. What are your thoughts about the statement, humans created God in order to explain the unknown, that which was not understood in the world? Nick, you have 2 minutes, and then Eddie will have 2 minutes as well for the same question.
Well, I'm going to go with what Eddie went with earlier. Eddie was saying, why are there so many religions? I think man is incurably religious. We seek answers. And I don't think the fact that there are so many religions, including cults, I don't think that's evidence against there being a God. Biblically speaking, the same book that Eddie quoted from, says there's none righteous, there's none that seek after God. We keep thinking that there's all these people in other religions, or the unsaved person living on a remote island that really is dying to know the true God. Scriptures say, Judeo-Christian scriptures say, if you draw near to me, I will draw near to you. God foreknows who will choose to follow him. And we can't limit necessarily missionary methods to just missionaries going. God can show up. He can send an angel, a theophany, a Christophany, and so forth. That being said, I do think that nature alone screams and demands answers. So I think, just like a child, you look up. You weren't taught atheism. Kids wonder. You weren't born with an atheistic mindset, I should say. You were born with wonder. You walk outside and you're like, you know what? Where did all this come from? Then your father tells you, from nowhere. Nothing created nothing, and you are just stardust, like Krauss would say. I think that sense of wonder that we all have produces false religion, false cults, and these are religious leaders that I think are taking advantage of peasants that need answers. So I don't think that we have, created God for some psychological need. That was not the case for me. I've always been some type of a theist. I believe that there was something greater than me. I didn't know what. I pursued the answer.
Well, here's the thing. Let's look at where the God that Nick really believes in and that believers in Judaism and Christianity and Islam came from. It all derives from a desert god from ancient Hebrew tribes. Now, that primitive concept that then found its way into the Old Testament, then the New Testament, then the Quran, and then the Book of Mormon, and whatever else, that is not veridical of the supernatural. So if you trace it back to the mythological origins of a desert tribal god, thou shalt have no other gods before me, your God is a jealous God, Jews are the chosen people. As my mom used to say after Auschwitz, let God choose somebody else, we don't want to be chosen anymore. When you look at all of this, you don't see any proof that there was an independent spiritual force that first manifested in only this little part of the Middle East and said, I'm the true creator of the whole universe. So it's obvious that given the physical parameters of the physical universe and the arguments I've made thus far, there is no independent disembodied intelligence that is undergirding all of reality. And looking up at the sky and being in wonder, the atheist can do that too. I can look at a beautiful sunset. I can look at a beautiful landscape and be filled with awe, but that's because I have a functional physical brain. That doesn't have to be grounded in a supernatural, magical being. And I think this is something that we need to know. But again, look at the derivation. All the deities that the monotheistic religions believe in trace back to a tribal Middle Eastern Hebrew desert god that certainly doesn't show any truth of existence.
Thank you. Our next question is for Eddie Tabash. So why is that humans seem to be hardwired to believe in a God, in that all cultures have similar myths about a God and how humans came to be if there is no God? You have 2 minutes.
The answer is very clear, and that's that fantasy always departs from reality. The fact that we might yearn for life after death doesn't mean it's going to happen. Look at the arguments I made from dependence of consciousness on the brain. The fact that millions and billions of human beings have been unable to face the reality that death is the extinction of us as individuals, and that we are floating alone in a vast and indifferent universe, and that we have to make our own meaning because there's no cosmic parent looking out for us. The fact that humans can't accept that and invent fantasies doesn't give them truth. We have no independent, freestanding truth of the supernatural, of the paranormal, of anything beyond the physical to give independent verification to the existence of such a being, so the mere yearning for it doesn't fill the gap. You can't legitimately say, I see no physical evidence for this being, but the fact that I yearn for it means it must be there. That's like the flawed ontological argument that says just because we can conceptualize a perfect being means it must exist in reality. The fact that the mind thinks something doesn't make it real. That sounds like some old episode from the Twilight Zone.
Nick, would you like to respond?
No, next question.
Okay. Nick, this is for you. From Plato to Nietzsche to Richard, oh my goodness, Rorby, I'm going to guess. There are many perspectives on morality. How do you reduce them to a dichotomy of objective morality versus relativism? Aren't things more complex than that?
In a sense, yes, but I also touched on situationism, I touched on generalism, where I mentioned them. There's antinomianism. Sure, there are different views of ethics, but they largely go into two camps. There are either, you have the absolutist camp. Sounds horrible, right? Absolutism. Well, there's objective morality, and then there's non-objective morality, which would be relativism. Under relativism, you have various systems, such as, for example, antinomianism against law, which would be like anarchy, or like Sex Pistols. Anti-nomos, against law, antinomianism, without law. Then you have situation ethics. You have various types of ethics. Within the absolutist camp, you have, for example, unqualified absolutism. You have graded absolutism. I go with graded absolutism. So there are different types of systems. But within those two main camps, my main claim was that if God exists, only then can we have an absolute objective moral value, because these moral values transcends us. They're above us. If God does not exist, then we're stuck. We're stuck with relativism, and that is mere social mores. You can't judge other cultures and so forth. I think we can judge other cultures. I think we can condemn Auschwitz. I think we can condemn what ISIS is doing. I think we can condemn the fact that women can't drive in Saudi Arabia. I think burqas are ridiculous. I can say that. I can say that these are clear violations of human rights. And I'm not believing that that's because I dreamt it up yesterday. I believe they're part of the moral furniture of the universe.
Eddie, would you like to?
But you see, here's the thing. We atheists don't have to be able to have a dead-bang, surefire location for objective moral values. We just have to show that our account of them is superior to that of rooting them in an alleged supernatural being. Again, Nick has not been able to demonstrate how the existence of this being grounds or assures us of what the moral values are. Because in order to say that these moral values emerge from a perfect being, he has to first be able to prove to us that God not only exists, but is perfect. And then we have the atrocities in the Bible, we have the amount of evil that occurs in this world. None of the things that Nick has just said about ISIS, about the denigration of women, about all of these things require grounding in an alleged supernatural being for us to exist. In fact, it is the Bible that talks about the subordination of women. Genesis 3:16 in the New Testament, woman shall not speak in the church. It's a shame for her to speak in the church. Ask her husband later. All these misogynistic things are in the Bible. So if we're not going to use the Bible and say, no, that's morally defective, where did this supernatural God then ground and locate these moral values so we can open up the treasure chest and say, here we are, we can rely on them, this is where God put them, and we know God is perfect. None of these proofs are in place for us to trust that there is a perfect God whose moral decrees we can trust in the first place, and who has actually revealed to us what these moral decrees are. And the fact that we can all agree on moral intuition, on what's right and wrong in these grand areas of human conflict today, demonstrates it's not necessary to invoke a supernatural being.
Thank you. This is for Eddie, and this begins with a biblical quote, I think. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. And he gives the quote Genesis 2:24. I'm sure you're familiar. And then the question then is, how does evolution explain father, mother, wife, and man, and the two becoming one, better than the book of Genesis? And he says, or whoever wrote this, we observe this exactly on the earth. How does evolution explain the origin of the family better?
Well, I think that the answer is very clear. First of all, since humans evolved from prior primitive states, like all other beings, we know that Adam and Eve is a myth, so that we see the family unit. The family unit is obviously a protective way for people to come together and form these units, and we don't need a divine origin for them. The fact that marriage gives the framework for raising children doesn't mean that all marriages have to be based on raising children. Otherwise, we would prohibit infertile couples from being able to marry. Also, if in fact the person who is quoting the Bible at me sees the marital institution as a legitimate institution ordained by the Bible, then that person has the burden of proof of demonstrating why that marvelous institution shouldn't be equally legally available to gay people. But the same Bible that talks about this marital union would deny it to other human beings who would join that union of those of the same gender. So the fact that evolution on natural selection gets us to make certain combinations of units is certainly not something that is so remarkable it requires a supernatural hand.
Thank you.
Oh wait, Nick has.
Oh, Nick?
Yeah, don't forget Nick.
You would answer that one, Nick?
Well, theologians themselves differ on whether Adam and Eve were literal. So if you want to take the literal approach or a non-literal approach, that's entirely up to you. I think that regardless of worldview, be it pantheistic, polytheistic, atheistic, be it theistic, whatever ism you want to add to it, we need to have an ancestor. So if the Judeo-Christian scripture says there was a first man and a woman named Adam and Eve, Adam means, or for man, means the piercer, and the female Eve is the pierced one. You guys can do the math. Plumbing fits. That being said, every worldview have to have a common ancestry somewhere. There has to be a first parent somewhere. I am not sold on macroevolution. Microevolution, yes. But I do think that the fact that you have male and female, it goes hand in hand with oughtness. Not just because you can reproduce, the plumbing fits a little better. People are born of heterosexual union. It's a healthier activity to engage in, and so forth. Does that scream evidence for the existence of God? Perhaps not. But getting back to the fact that every worldview have to give an account for a first parent somewhere. Biblically, I think they have the answers in Genesis.
Thank you. This next question is for Nick. People claim that God and or Jesus cured their ills when visiting Lourdes in France. Yet, the Catholic Church acknowledges only a handful of miracles, and Carl Sagan calculated that with spontaneous remissions, the visitors were more likely to recover from ills by staying home. Aren't people being deceived into believing supernatural or God-caused cures instead of simply hope or natural cures?
There's a lot of things in that question. Too much for 2 minutes. Of course, people are being deceived. You can tell that by just watching some of these religious shows on television. There are people that take advantage of the masses, the hoi polloi, like the Greeks would call it. And there's a special place for them in the afterlife. You know, when you're ripping off people and promising prosperity and you know, so forth. But I am still of the view that if God exists, he definitely can heal people. So are there false preachers? Are there false religious leaders? Yeah, I think that goes for all religions. I'm not a Roman Catholic, so I'm not going to speak for them, what happened in Lourdes. But my wife has had cancer twice. I'm not going to say that prayer healed her or God healed her, but I do know that we were on our knees and on our faces for it not to come back. Maybe it'll come back a third time. Here's the real problem. Let's suppose that God did heal my wife twice. How many times does he have to heal her? We're all going to check out one day. So if he's healed her twice already, let's just suppose he did, and he heals her another 10 times. Is he morally obligated to heal her, you know, a 29th time? Eventually, our bodies will give in. And again, from a theistic point of view, that's because we live in a fallen world. So God can heal. He doesn't always heal. But maybe you can also speculate and say maybe he's pre-healing you before the disease that's going to hit you next week. That's just, I mean, we could sit here and philosophize all day long.
Thank you. Eddie, would you like
There
to
has
say?
not been a single verified instance of paranormal or supernatural cure in human history. As Mark Smith, who's with us tonight, has said, prayer has never had an amputee regrow a limb. You'll never see that happen. So there is no evidence that this occurs. And again, evidence of absence of evidence is evidence of absence. It's not there. And how do you rely on it? How would you say of the 3 million cures for this disease that were accomplished by medical science, this particular cure for this particular family member, I trust to a spiritual method? We can't take that risk. See, we can't take that risk. Again, where is the evidence? Now, you see, Nick did something really, really sincere and honest. He mentioned his wife's recovery and mentioned that he can't say for sure that it came from God. But I'm extending that. I'm saying no one can be sure that something paranormal cures an ill human being, so we can't even begin to take the risk. Let there be one verified instance of an amputated limb regrowing. Let me right now shoot up from 5'6" to 6'5", and I'm joining this church. So you have to understand, it's a question of proof. We can't run away from that. This debate is about proving the supernatural in a context where all we see is the natural.
Thank you. Nick, this is for you. I'm going to do my best to read this. You say we cannot have morals without God. Why then do we see in the northern European countries, which have an 85% atheistic population, and they live in the most moral behavior with murder rates, as well as many other social measurements, leading the world in happiness?
I didn't say you can't have morals without God. I'm saying you can't justify why there is amorality apart from the theistic God existing. I didn't say you can't have morals. I believe that conscience and morality is woven into our being. And I'm trying to justify by saying that objective moral law comes from a moral lawgiver. My opponent earlier says that doesn't prove anything. I have to prove how it flows from the nature of God, if God wills it, or could he reverse the Ten Commandments and so forth. No, he couldn't. Well, he is good by nature, and morality flows from his being. We'll talk about the atrocities in my closing statements, but I'm from Sweden. It's a very secular country, Nordic Europe, Scandinavia, some very immoral people that live there. They're taking in tons of refugees, which I'm sure will not backfire. Just kidding. It will in time. But that being said, extremely PC. They live moral lives. All we're saying here is, what is the reason to be moral? And why is there a morality? If there even is a morality. I don't think there is a morality if the theistic God does not exist. Only social mores, where we assign meaning, and man created temporary laws, and what happens in Zimbabwe is different from Stockholm, what happens in Cajamarca is different from Los Angeles, and who are we to judge what they do there? No, you need an absolute standard of right and wrong that transcends us, that says all of these cultures are wrong in doing X, Y, and Z. Here's the right thing.
Thank you. Eddie?
We see, again, the problem is Nick has to prove that God's perfect nature is the fount of objective moral values, and then he has to show us where God deposited them for us to find them. If he's going to say God deposited them in the Bible, then I'm going to point to the atrocities in the Bible that cannot be justified on any kind of rational moral basis. If Nick is going to say, well, God put them somewhere else, I'm going to say, fine, Nick, let us then do this great Easter egg hunt and find where these objective moral values from God are buried, but we have a right to know where they are deposited. Now, Nick did say something which is true, which is that these moral notions are interwoven into our being and consciousness. Yes, they are by virtue of our evolutionary development, but they don't require grounding in a supernatural being. And if they do, Nick has to demonstrate how that supernatural being can be trusted. And once again, where is the reliable, non-defective location of these objective moral values where we can say whatever we find in this book or this box, we can agree is an objective moral value, and we don't have to worry that any of it will be wrong.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. This question is for Eddie, and it merely says, who are we talking about? Who are you trying to explain away?
What?
Who are we talking about? Who are you trying to explain away?
Okay, both Nick and I, though he's trying to say it's real, I'm trying to say it's not real, are speaking about an all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing being that created and sustains the universe and that has revealed itself in certain ways to humanity. My argument is that because that being is claimed to be invisible and immaterial and to have supernatural powers, and there's not one reliable manifestation of a supernatural event in the history of the world, certainly not in contemporary society, and I'd sure love to witness directly with Nick these kids being possessed and watch them do supernatural things like walking on ceilings, but in the absence of that, we are talking about this supposedly all-powerful, all-good being for which I claim there is no actual evidence. And because I claim there is no actual evidence, that evidence has to be produced. Now, I can easily tell you that if miracles as described in the Bible would happen before my eyes, if the sun stood still, if all of a sudden I'd see chariots of fire, if I were elevated, like St. Paul claims, to the third or the seventh or even the first heaven, then I would probably adopt some kind of religious view. But if God exists, God knows this, and God knows that my inability to believe is because of the absence of evidence. Like Bertrand Russell said, what if you die and you find out there's a God? What do you say to God? He'll say, God, it's your fault. You didn't give me enough evidence while I was alive.
Thank you. Nick, would you like to answer that? Who are we talking about? Who are you trying to explain away is the question.
No, I think that's clear.
Okay, thank you. We're now going to have 15 minutes for each debater to give their closing arguments. Nick Keehus, please come up.
If I invited you to an exorcism, would you go, Eddie?
Absolutely.
Okay, it's on. I flew up to San Jose to interview the chief exorcist for that area, and the movie The Rite with Anthony Hopkins was based on his life. And I did a 3-hour interview, but that's secondary because I didn't see the things that he witnessed while in Rome. So that wouldn't be good enough for Eddie to meet with this guy. But maybe I'll talk to Dr. Kraft or someone in Pasadena, and we'll go in and sit on one. I actually showed up on one, and I fell asleep because there was no possession. That being said, I want to just reiterate some of the points that we didn't have time to touch on in the rebuttal. How does a demon, a non-physical being, possess a physical body? It depends on what your view is on dualism. I believe that there's two natures to you. You have a physical body and you have an immaterial body, a soul. And so if you are a materialist, of course, you will run against the wall. A demon can possess your physical body, but not possess your soul. That's the one that's so-called saved, where the Holy Spirit would dwell. Morality. Nick assumes God is necessary and for morality, and somehow I need to prove, not from the Bible. I'm not going to use the Bible as proof that he's good. I'm going to say that the whole notion where we have this intrinsic moral value within us must come from somewhere. Either it's chance or it's by design. I go by design. I don't have to prove from the scriptures. Right here is how that morality is subjective and why. Any more than the universe was caused. I wasn't there, nor was Eddie. We have no idea. But if the universe were caused, we can conclude that there is a designer or cause behind that effect. He mentioned some of the atrocities that we have in the scriptures. When you look at, for example, what happened to the Amalekites, the Hittites, or say, for example, the Canaanites, here's a couple of things that we have to keep in mind if we're going to do historical and biblical hermeneutics. And that is, in the context, God issues commands with a heavy and grieved heart. You have that in Genesis 6:6 and Ezekiel, with heavy and grieved heart. He doesn't desire judgment. He doesn't seek to afflict willingly. Now, God had patiently waited for half a millennium, including 430 years in Egypt, until the Canaanites, right? The sins of the Canaanites that he brought up, the Amalekites as well, how could God destroy them, and so forth. I want to answer that because I think that's an important question. Paul Capan has done a lot of work in this area. Is God a moral monster? Pick that book up or attend a lecture. When you read of Baal in the Tanakh, the Old Testament, B-A-A-L, Baal, what were these Canaanites worshiping? I'll give you the short version real quick. Let's suppose that ISIS took East LA hostage. And they're raping women in every house. They're, cleaning out every liquor store. And no one is going in or out. Cops won't even go. And so somebody says, hey, why don't we just send in the National Guard and mow down ISIS? Would you have a problem with that? Would that be an act of justified war, or would it be unjustified war to go in and take out ISIS from East LA? Well, the Canaanites sort of behaved the same way. Here are some of the things. The Baal cycle, which is Canaanite epic poems. One of them reads, Baal has sex with Heifer 70 times and 80 times 8, and she bears a boy. Baal raped his sister. That was the god they worshiped. Raped his sister, a goddess of war, while she was in the form of a calf. A calf. Hittite law. This is 1600 BC. So you're right around the Middle Bronze Age. Hittite law, if a father and a son sleep with a female slave or prostitute, it is not an offense. But then again, Edward Tabash wants to legalize prostitution, so maybe we could take some of that Canaanite law and apply it. What about Hittite laws? If a man has sexual relations with either a horse or a mule, it is not an offense. So bestiality, I've been to a Canaanite altar in Israel, unhewn stone. They used to just sacrifice virgins there. They would light statues of fire. Golden brass statues like this, heat them up and cook babies while they had orgies, sex in the field. That's who God says, hey, go in and take them out. They had plenty of time to leave. I do not believe that mothers and children were destroyed. Oh, aren't you being selective now, Nick? No, because the very next verses, you read that the Canaanites dwelt in the land with Israelites together. So they weren't all wiped out. Common warfare in those days, figurative speech, war language, was sort of like exaggerations. You see that. You know, we went in and destroyed the whole city. No, you didn't, because in the next verse, you wrote that you lived with the Hittites or the Amalekites in the land. So in one verse, you can't just run with that. You got to read the whole context. I believe that the women and the children were not there. Now you're stuck with warriors or the military. That's who Joshua was fighting. And I think just a basic hermeneutic will answer that if you read the whole thing in context. So God wiped out the male ISIS of the day. God, evil, and theodicy. We keep going back to that point. If it is logically possible for God to have good reasons, some of which are unknown to us, there's no direct contradiction between an omnipotent being like God and allowing evil, resulting from your exercise of freedom. We make choices every single day. Some of them are not so good. The way you exercise your freedom, every single choice, you can go this way or that way. Just because God foreknows if that will be a poor, immoral, or just a bad decision, doesn't make him responsible for your decision. He honors free will. You know, it's sort of like thy will be done, that whole notion. Okay, one of these days when we all go home, if you want nothing to do with God and the theistic God exists, he'll respect that too. He'll go, thy will be done. You know, if God were to force every single person that doesn't want anything to do with God, you know, hates everything about it, makes no sense, he's just a moral monster, not going to look into it any further, well, heaven would be hell for those people. So he's not going to force them in. Same thing, so he honors free will. So long as God has good reasons for allowing evil, there's no contradiction between you having freedom, exercising your freedom wrongly, running the risk of going against what ought to be avoided. We keep going back to pre-DNA or rDNA. rDNA still requires design because there is information within it. Real brief, you know, the existence of information is not improbable given theism. I'm guarding here. The existence of information is very improbable given naturalism. Therefore, given 1 and 2, in the prime principle of confirmation, it follows that the information data that is provided in this world gives strong or stronger evidence in favor of the theistic hypotheses over naturalism. You know, typically when you observe information, you assume it came from a mind. I think that's very strong. And Eddie and I just seem to disagree on that. It's sort of like I don't get it. Only specified complexity as life requires a cost. Life is a specified complexity, therefore life is cost. I think the argument follows. I think it's a stretch to argue that we came from mere chance. I don't think that we're accidental freaks of nature. You're more than walking stardust or a cluster of molecules. There's more to it than that. Multiverses and more. Some say this planet is the lucky one. Just because there are helter-skelter universes out there does not mean that this universe was not created. Moreover, infinite regress goes against multiverses as well. While it may be logically possible for multiverses or to exist and other bizarre things that we can't fully prove, they're hypotheses, are they scientifically tenable? No, they're not. Logical probability is not the same as it will occur one day. There's a lot of logical possibilities, you know. Eddie's an attorney, so you can show up and say, isn't it logical possible that? And he's going to go, sure, but how likely is it? How likely is it scientifically? I will submit. Now, when I stated the argument, whatever begins to exist requires a cause, William Lane Craig is the foremost defender of this argument. He reinvented Al-Ghazali's wheel and Al-Kindi and ran with it. He says here, quote, if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause for its beginning. This more modest version of the first argument will enable us to avoid distractions whether subatomic particles, which are the result of quantum decay processes, come into being without a cause. This alleged exception to 1, meaning referring to anything that begins to exist, 2 would be irrelevant if we were to say, if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause for its beginning, unquote. Craig continues, for the universe comprises all contiguous space-time reality. Therefore, for the whole universe to come into being without a cause is to come into being from nothing, which is absurd. For something to come into being from nothing is absurd. In quantum decay events, the particles do not come into being from nothing. They're already part of the universe. As Christopher Isham, Britain's premier quantum cosmologist, he cautions, care is needed when using the word creation in a physical context. One familiar example is the creation of elementary particles in the accelerator. However, what occurs in this situation is the conversion of one type of matter into another. It's still existent matter, with the total amount of energy being preserved in the process. Earlier, Mr. Tabash was mentioning Jesus. You know, why would Jesus pray to himself? If Jesus and God are one, how could he pray to himself? You got to read more theology if we're going to get into theology. You know, I don't know if he's confused about the Trinitarian concept, but I don't think so. He's well studied. First of all, when Jesus was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, and I've been there, I don't believe that he was forsaken, first of all. You have to read that in Old Testament context, where you have Psalm 22, you have Isaiah 53. Those two chapters should be read very well. When Christ is on the cross, he is quoting Psalm 22. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? You read Psalm 22 and drop down to verse 24. It says, but when he cried, he, Father, heard. So Jesus was not forsaken. If he was forsaken on the cross, you rip the divine Godhead apart. Right? So he wasn't forsaken. Physically, he could have felt forsaken, but ontologically, he was not forsaken. If God the Father abandoned the Son on the cross, he would rip the Trinity in half. God the Father, who is not the incarnated Son, within one nature, one ontological what? There are three whoms. There are three persons within the one ontological nature of God. So we're not saying that there are three gods over here and one God over here. We're saying that there's one God. That's one nature, one ontological oneness that consists of three whoms. No contradiction at all. So Jesus, being subordinate to the Father, in his diophysis, or dual nature form, into one hypostatic union. I didn't make these words up, but it's a shorter way to talk about it. There's no problem for him to communicate with the Father. When he says, why you've forsaken me, that's answered by Isaiah and Psalm 22. So just wanted to touch on that point. Now, the subatomic realm. Even if one grants that a photon of light can pop into existence from a quantum ghost, meaning out of sheer nothingness, it does not follow that the first event did not need a cause. That's simple. Even if one can make statements like the one about quantum ghosts intelligible, I don't think you can. But macro events still need causes. It is also an unwarranted extrapolation to argue from the micro level to the macro level, unquote, Dr. Craig. Now, even the atheist, Quinton Smith, he concludes that these state nothing about the causality or a non-causality of absolute beginnings, or beginnings of the existence of particles. That is, of course, much more there's a lot more to learn about quantum physics. We're just barely scratching the surface on that. But we're after actual beginnings. Now, what about design? And design is poor design. God could have done a better job. You know, there are three types of complexity in life. Specified order, there's unspecified complexity, and specified complexity. Specified order, which is a repeated set of information. Take a snowflake, for example, and I don't mean the leftists, but snowflakes are produced by nature, and as such are natural, right? Now, unspecified complexity would be random, but they're not repetitious. They're also natural phenomenon. For example, take a bedrock. You know, it's shaped and caused by natural phenomena or natural law. What is specified complexity? You know, versus oceans, you know, hitting land, and it ends up looking like Sunset Beach or downtown Huntington. Well, those are natural events. Specified complexity is quite different. It's not that they're not random or repetitive. In comparing natural shape to bedrock is quite different from specified complexity. Take, for example, the city of Dubai. That is specified complexity versus a waterfall that's caused by natural means. I already touched on the fact that God is not a moral monster. I will reiterate, though, that if God exists, this moral clock that we have within us, or like one of my mentors, Norman Geisler, said, there's a baloney meter in here. You hear something false, it goes off. Someone says, go ahead and do this, and it's wrong. Where does that come from? I'm not pointing to the scriptures. He has revealed certain laws, like the Ten Commandments, but why is there a notion at all? Without the Bible, people are living lives as if objective morality is real. Thank you.
Eddie Tabash, you now have 15 minutes for your closing remarks.
In discussing and trying to defend exorcisms, Nick said that he believes in the duality of the body and mind so that demonic possessions could exist, but he didn't demonstrate how such duality exists. He just claims he believes in it. Now, if he's not willing to say specifically that the moral code that God gives us is located in the Bible, because of a lot of these atrocities in the Bible, he has to show us where they're located. If he says, look under that rock and you'll find them, and I find them to be reliable, I'll concede the argument, but Nick has not directed us to where that could be done. Now, he says God does things with a heavy heart. So this means that an omnipotent, omniscient being, all-powerful being, and all-knowing being gets depressed when he has to wipe out some of his creations. Well, he could certainly be able to put into the hearts of some of these people to behave a little better and give them certain impetus. And now Nick would say, well, that violates their free will. First of all, why is free will such a value that it overcomes everything else? Why should we allow ISIS and Nazis to torture and kill people without divine intervention to stop them just so they can exercise their free will? If you have two kids and one is about to push the other over a cliff, you won't let it happen just so that the pushing child will be able to experience the adverse consequences of free will. Now, he says the Canaanites did all of these horrible things, but these are ancient stories that haven't been verified. We don't know that the Canaanites did these things. And even if the Canaanites did these things, how do we justify the God of the Old Testament wiping out the women and children among the Amalekites? And the God of the Bible definitely commands rape, not only just approves of it, because he told Moses' invading army to kill the non-virgins and forcibly take the virgins onto themselves. Now, if you invade a city or a tribe and you kill women only because they were not virgins, but keep alive women who are virgins, you certainly, if you command that, are not the fount of that moral intuition and that right and wrong that Nick says is buried in our hearts. And if it's not in the Bible, he needs to show where it's located. So that would make the God of the Bible a moral monster. Now, he talks about good reason for evil to occur, and that he will make it right at the end of time, but we don't have that end of time yet. We need to have explanation from God now why these horrible things happen, and if God is not forthcoming with that explanation, we have a right to then say it's far more likely than not that a God that wants us to believe in him does not exist, because a God who wants to believe in him would show us these explanations. Now, he mentions that he can't see how the specified information or anything mental physical could transmit DNA, RNA. But we certainly see information genetically transferred. The whole purpose of genes is to genetically transfer information, and there is no proof whatsoever that this process could not occur without a supernatural ghost in the machinery. And in terms of his defense of Bill Craig's cosmological argument, he says that everything that exists needs a cause, but that's everything that exists in already existing universe. He makes the fallacy of composition, and he's saying that just because everything in the universe needs a cause doesn't mean the universe as a whole. And I agree with him for purposes of tonight's debate that the universe began with the Big Bang, but that also means time and space began with the Big Bang. So if time and space began with the Big Bang, there was no precursor period where A could cause B. So on current knowledge, we can't even speak of the cause of the universe, and that doesn't justify substituting in a God of the gaps. Now, he said in the Old Testament, Jesus wasn't forsaken. He might have just felt he was forsaken. But if Jesus and God are one, then Jesus couldn't even feel forsaken. It's like I'm saying, you know what, I thought I had forsaken myself last night, then I realized I didn't. That really wouldn't make any sense. So the first event, if it required something outside of space and time to do something, could not have happened. And that takes care of the cosmological argument. Again, with specified complexity, he has not yet shown that the genetic transmissions of these things are impossible. And he has not yet shown they are required. Now, he actually defeats his own argument for supernatural design when he compares the city of Dubai to a waterfall. And we know that the city of Dubai, cities are manufactured by people. We don't have the same with the waterfall. It's like William Paley's famous watch. If you find a watch lying on the ground, you know it was manufactured by an intelligent human being. But if you find rocks and trees and plants, you have no such knowledge, and there is no such exaggeration. He tries to defend the atrocities of what the God of the Bible did, but he ignores for instance, that Exodus 4:24-7, God sought to kill Moses because Moses had not yet circumcised his son. That, to me, is not a rational being. And the moral intuition that Nick says is in my heart says the God that sought to do that was a maniac. And then in Deuteronomy chapter 13, you're supposed to stone to death any family member, wife, brother, son, or daughter who beckons you to worship some other god. And then you're supposed to kill anyone in the city in which you live who worships another god. Deuteronomy 17, stone to death any who have worshipped some other god. So that basically means if your daughter or son comes to you and says, hey, mom, pop, let's go worship Buddha, you're supposed to kill them. That's clear, that's unmistakable. Now, with respect to the fine-tuning argument, again, I demonstrated how there were very, very many areas where these constants and parameters had a great range of variance and didn't need to be so finely tuned. And even if those variances took place, varying their current valences and their current conditions, we still wouldn't have a collapse. Also, ultimately, a deity that could make us live in any environment wouldn't need to fine-tune the universe in the first place. Also, if the universe is fine-tuned for life, how come 95% of it is lethal with dark holes and dark matter? It's as if you look at the Earth and you look at what it was best designed for and what there is most of, you would have to say that God made the Earth with insects in mind, because they essentially have the best environment in which to thrive. Now, he spoke in his opening statement about how the desire for immortality and the yearning for it gives credence to the fact that it probably does exist. That totally ignores my argument from physical minds of how consciousness is dependent on the physical brain, which he was never able to overcome except by assertions with no proof. And the mere desire for something does not bring it about. You might desire for there to be a perfect God who will make it all right in the end. The mere fact that you desire that does not in any way constitute that it will take place. And in essentially his argument from mathematics, you could easily see that the mathematical axioms that he talks about could not be false. 2 and 2 could not be other than 4, and so it is more likely on naturalism than on theism that we have these laws, because on theism, God wouldn't need laws of physics, laws of logic, laws of mathematics, but we do need those, and they seem to be inviolable and built into the very fabric of reality, which means that no mind, even a divine mind, could make them untrue. So that means that God could not say in a reissued, updated Bible, I now decree 2 + 2 = 5. Even God's decreeing that wouldn't make it so. So the argument about the existence of logic and mathematics and information are actually arguments in favor of atheism as opposed to theism, because they are presented in such a way in which no one could vary them. With respect to, again, the cosmological argument, in order for a being to create something, that being would have to enter time. So I want to refer back to my argument against God's existence from the improbability of a transcendent person. A transcendent person is outside of time. So how could it be that this is just an ad hoc assertion? God existed forever into the past, an infinity forever into the past in God time, and God said, I'm going to create the universe at what will exactly be 13.7 billion years ago from September 28th, 2017. See, how could you conceptualize the time to create the universe if you are a being outside of time? Also, he was not able to argue against my argument from scale. He admitted that he was a believer in the Bible and tried to defend some of the things in the Bible. Well then, why didn't the Bible tell us that we are just one among billions and billions of other creatures that God cares about? The Bible makes it seem like we are the primary concern of this deity. If we are the primary concern of this deity, it makes no sense to have so many billions and billions of unnecessary props and endless debris. If there are billions and trillions and septillions of other planets in the universe, which just by sheer probability have a great probability of intelligent life, why only us and no one else? Also, there is the whole argument in terms of formally rejecting the supernatural based on Bayes' theorem, where we use the calculus of prior probability to assess the likelihood of something existing or not. But an element of the steps of Bayes' theorem is background information. We have no background information of any supernatural event. So with no background information of any supernatural event, the prior probability about calculating the likelihood of a supernatural or paranormal event is very low. So on that alone, atheism is much more likely than theism. He also was not able to overcome my argument from evil that if God is truly all-powerful and all-good, then all the evil God allows or permits or actually does would have to be of such that God, with all his power, couldn't have prevented an even greater evil, or there was a good so great as to justify the evil and suffering, and with all his power, God couldn't figure out a way to bring about that greater good but for the horrendous suffering. This is a very, very high hurdle for a omnipotent being to hold. And also, Nick never refuted my contention that in order for God to allow any evil and suffering to occur, God must have a morally sufficient reason for doing so. He also never was able to demonstrate, again, an underlying foundation. He made a valiant attempt to grasp at supernatural straws in a natural universe, but he never showed us how the immaterial being did it. Just by saying he believes in duality doesn't tell us how a demon could possess. Just because he asserted it doesn't mean he explains the mechanism by which something with no body, no physical brain, outside of time, could create time and space and matter. If you look dispassionately, objectively at the evidence in our physical universe, you'll see philosophically and scientifically it's far more likely than not that there is no God. The universe is wholly natural and not supernatural. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to thank Nick Keehus and Eddie Tabash for agreeing to debate here tonight. And I thank you so much for your thoughtful questions and your careful attention tonight. And I hope tonight's debate is giving you food for thought on this vitally important topic. And good evening, and thank you for attending tonight's debate.